What is a theology of holiness? Well, as any theology should, it begins with the character and nature of God. Scripture reveals that God is holy, and that God's holiness is rooted in God's nature, which is numinous or other. Scripture reveals the call for God's people to be holy as God is holy. And we see themes of holiness reaching all the way back into Judaism in places like Leviticus 19. While there are many voices and dimensions to how holiness is approached in Scripture, across the biblical narrative, we see consistently that Scripture reveals holiness to be relational, defined by the covenant relationship between God and God's people. Holiness is also approached as practical. It's to be lived out and embodied. A theology of holiness reflects our attempts to understand and embody God's call to holiness. As those who are in the Wesleyan tradition, our theology of holiness is grounded in the conviction that holiness and the life free of sin, which results from holiness, are possible in this life, not just after death. Now, holiness does have soteriological implications because it incorporates the understanding of salvation by justification and synthesizes that with the Eastern understanding of theosis, or healing, as Dr. Gaines stated in one of our lectures. Our concept of holiness is formed by Wesley's own understanding of the via salutis, the way of salvation. We and all humanity experience God's prevenient grace at work in creation. And then upon the recognition by the grace of God that we are sinners in need of God's grace, we experience justification and regeneration simultaneously. This is also the beginning of the work of sanctification in which we grow in grace, as Dr. Tim Gaines explains. T.A. Noble states, real Christian experience is quite simply falling in love with God. And when we do that, we are never more rational, never more truly human, never more spiritually and intellectually awakened, never more at our best. It is objective experience of the real and living God that results in the subjective inner and outward change we call sanctification. The work of sanctification is not so much a process by which sin is removed, but rather a process by which our hearts become so filled by love of God and love of others, that sin is pushed out. The result is entire sanctification. The result that we are so filled with love that we have no room left in our heart for sin, which is the perversion of love, according to Mildred Bangs Wynkoop. This is what Wesley referred to as a Christian perfection, the filling of our hearts with love to the exclusion of sin. And Wesley states, Christian perfection is the love of God and our neighbor, which implies deliverance from sin, as well as the simplicity of intention and purity of affection, which implies a singularity of devotion. Wesley states that this is a gift of grace we receive in faith, and that Christian perfection, the filling of our heart with God's love, is something we are to expect not at death, but every moment. And those are his own words. In this sense, holiness is indeed relational as well as dynamic. To the capacity with which our heart can be filled with God's love, it is being filled. And as our capacity grows, as we mature intellectually and emotionally and certainly spiritually, so too grows our capacity for our heart to be filled to an even greater depth. Wynkoop states, love is the essential inner character of holiness, and holiness does not exist apart from love. So if holiness is to be filled with God, God's love, what is holiness not? Well, it isn't perfectionism. Holiness does not mean we are no longer capable of making mistakes. We still need God's grace. Wesley himself asserted that he would never claim we can aspire to sinless perfection, but that we can aspire to Christian perfection, which he described as love governing the heart and life, running through all our tempers, words, and actions. Holiness is also not a withdrawal from the world, nor is it a rejection of everything that is worldly or human. Wynkoop states, it's not the suppression of human impulse, but the centering of the entire heart and life and activity in God. This theology of holiness is not a list of behaviors to check off, and it's not a list of people and places and situations to avoid, but rather an invitation to experience and then express love of God and love for others. This theology of holiness is a theology that gives life, that inspires joy, that erodes shame, and that centers us in gratitude on God and the work God is doing in the world, and then propels us outward to express God's love as we participate in that work.